My hands remember the rhythm better than my mind does. If I close my eyes now, sitting in this chair that smells of lavender and old dust, I can still feel the vibration of the Essen floorboards. It was a steady, thrumming pulse, the heartbeat of the fatherland's industry. Back then, before the world turned gray, I was a creature of oil and calipers. I knew that if I applied exactly 3 Newton meters of torque to a flange, it would hold. I knew that if the lathe hummed in a low G major, the bearings were well lubricated. The world was a blueprint. It had lines, it had dimensions, and if something was broken, it was simply a matter of finding the right wrench to fix it. There was a comfort in that, a divine predictability. You put steel in, you applied logic, and function came out. But memory is a liar. It paints the past in sepia and gold, scrubbing away the grime. It tries to tell me that I was a man of importance, a builder. But when the wind rattles the window pane here, the Essen factory vanishes. The warmth of the machine shop is sucked away, replaced by a cold so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Stalingrad 1942. I looked down at my hands. They were not the dexterous, grease-stained hands of the mechanic anymore. They were claws, blue-white and mottled, fumbling with the bolt of a car 98K. The metal bit into my skin, sticky with frost. I was trying to clean the firing pin, a ritual of maintenance that I clung to like a rosary, but my fingers were numb, betraying me. We were huddled in a trench that was less a fortification and more a scar in the frozen mud. A jagged line drawn through the debris of what used to be a city. The silence was the worst part. You would think it was the artillery, or the screaming of the Nebelwerfer rockets that tore the sky apart. But those were honest sounds. You knew where you stood with an explosion. It was the quiet that killed you. In the silence, the mind starts to map the invisible. I found myself staring at a patch of snow 3 meters to my left. It was pristine, white, unbroken. To anyone else, it was just winter. To me, a sapper, it was a question. Was the snow slightly depressed there? Had the frost heaved the earth in a way that suggested a disturbed layer of soil underneath? The Russians were cunning. They didn't just fight with rifles. They fought with gravity, with tension, with the unsuspecting curiosity of a tired soldier. A wooden box mine, undetectable by magnetic sweepers, waiting for a boot heel. A tripwire painted white, strung at ankle height. I hated the waiting. In Essen, waiting meant the shift was over. Here, waiting meant you were still alive, but for how long? I rubbed a rag over the rifle bolt, the smell of gun oil sharp and biting in the thin air. It was the only scent that reminded me of home, yet here it was perverted, mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies and the sickly sweet odor of rotting things hidden under the snow. Richter, a voice rasped beside me. It was Hank. He was 19, I think, or maybe 20. His face was wrapped in a woolen scarf, only his eyes visible, wide and rimmed with red. Do you hear that? Hear what? I didn't look up from the rifle. Nothing, he whispered. Exactly. I didn't answer him. I was busy tracing the imaginary lines of tension in the trench wall. If a shell hit 10 meters to the right, the structural integrity of this dugout would fail. The timber supports were rotted. We would be buried. It was a simple calculation of load and resistance. I tried to push the thought away, to retreat back to the lathe in Essen, to the feeling of a micrometer clicking perfectly into place. But the factory of my memory was fading, overlaid by the jagged silhouette of the ruins ahead. I was a sapper. My job was to build and to destroy, but mostly it was to solve problems. And the problem here was that the rules of mechanics didn't apply. You couldn't fix this war with a wrench. You couldn't calibrate the insanity. A harsh shout shattered the stillness, cutting through the wind like a whip crack. On your feet. Gear up, it was Feldwebel Kroll. He moved down the line, kicking boots, his voice a gravelly bark that brokered no hesitation. We're moving. The Red October. Command wants the district cleared by nightfall. The Red October. The steel plant. A heavy stone dropped in my gut. I knew of it. Of course, a sprawling industrial complex, a cathedral of machinery. In another life I might have admired its layout, studied its blast furnaces. Now it was a fortress of twisted iron and shadows. I reassembled the rifle, the bolt sliding home with a metallic clatter that sounded obscenely loud. I checked my pouches, wire cutters, crimpers, a few blocks of coarse explosives. My satchel felt heavy, a burden of destructive potential. I stood up, my knees popping, the cold rushing into the gaps in my greatcoat. We climbed out of the trench, moving like ghosts against the gray sky. The landscape was a monochromatic nightmare. Black skeletons of buildings poked through the white drifts, their windows like empty eye sockets staring accusingly at us. The wind moaned a low, constant keen that sounded like a child crying in the next room. I walked with my eyes on the ground. Stab, scan, stab, scan. I didn't look at the horizon. The horizon was too far away. Survival was in the immediate meter of earth before you. I watched for the glint of copper wire, for the unnatural flatness of a buried mine. My breath plumed before me, freezing on my mustache. We crested a mound of rubble, and there it was. The Red October factory. It was a beast, a sprawling, mangled leviathan of corrugated iron and brick, torn open by Stuka bombs and artillery fire. Smoke drifted lazily from its guts. It looked less like a building and more like a crash site, a graveyard of industry. It was a twisted parody of the place I had loved in Essen. There, the factory was a womb of creation. Here it was a maw. Kroll raised his hand, signaling a halt. We fanned out a dozen shivering men against the backdrop of industrial slaughter. The entrance to one of the main workshops loomed ahead, a dark, gaping hole where a blast door used to be. Richter, Kroll hissed, pointing his MP40 toward the darkness. "You're up. Check the threshold." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, entirely out of sync with the cold precision of my mind. I moved forward, crouching low. This was the moment. The threshold, the line between the open misery of the snow and the enclosed terror of the machine. I reached the edge of the shattered concrete. I could smell it now, the stale, metallic scent of the factory interior, mixed with cordite and damp ash. It smelled like a workshop that had died. I looked back at the squad. Hank was watching me, his eyes pleading. I turned back to the dark. There was no logic here, only luck, and the grim hope that the Russian who laid the trap was colder and more tired than I was. "Vorwärts," Kroll whispered. I stepped into the darkness. "Steady, it's just a linkage. Disconnect the linkage." BRRRP. Clang, 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 clang. Thump, thump, thump. 21. 22, 23, 24, 25. I woke up because I couldn't breathe. There was a weight on my chest, a crushing, suffocating pressure. I clawed upward, my fingernails tearing against rough stone. Light broke through, gray, dusty light. I pushed debris off my legs. I sat up. The air was thick with gray powder, swirling in the shafts of sunlight like falling snow. I looked toward the foreman's office. It was gone. The wall was gone. The machine gun nest was a gaping maw of twisted rebar and pulverized concrete. The heavy steel lathe I had hidden behind was overturned, tossed like a child's toy. I tried to listen for the enemy, but there was only a high, thin whine, like a mosquito trapped inside my skull. My ears were dead. I looked at my hands. They were black with soot, bleeding from a dozen small cuts. My squad mates were pulling themselves from the rubble. They were shouting, their mouths moving in wide, grotesque shapes, but I heard nothing. The young rifleman was clapping me on the shoulder, grinning, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. He was pointing at the ruin of the office. He was calling me a hero. I looked down at my hands again. These hands had fixed bicycles in Essen. They had repaired my mother's sewing machine. They had adjusted the timing on the factory whistles. And now, they had improvised a slaughter. I felt a sickness rise in my gut, a cold, greasy nausea that had nothing to do with the concussion. I had used my gift, my understanding of how things worked, to unmake the world. The scene dissolves. The gray dust of Stalingrad settles, heavier and heavier, until it becomes the sawdust of a workshop floor. I am old now. The hands are the same, though the skin is like parchment, spotted with age. I am standing in my shop in Essen. The walls are lined with tools, wrenches, calipers, hammers, drills. They hang in orderly rows, silent and obedient. For 20 years after the war, I could not touch them. I would walk past a hardware store and feel the phantom weight of that gearbox bomb in my arms. I would pick up a screwdriver and feel the grit of the artillery shells fuse grinding against my palm. The mechanics of the world had been poisoned for me. Every machine was a potential weapon. Every assembly was a bomb waiting to be rigged. They called it shell shock. They called it fatigue. But it was simpler than that. It was the corruption of the craft. I pick up a wrench now. It feels cold. I am trying to restore an old clock, a delicate thing of brass and springs. But my hands hesitate. I stare at the gears, and for a split second, they are not brass gears ticking out the time. They are shrapnel. They are the jagged teeth I packed into that cast iron casing. I put the wrench down. I cannot fix the clock. The mechanism is flawed because the mechanic is flawed. I look up, past the tools, past the dusty window where the modern world rushes by. Oblivious, they tell you to use your gifts for the fatherland. They praise your ingenuity. They give you medals for resourcefulness. But they never tell you that the fatherland will scar those gifts forever. They don't tell you that once you turn a tool into a weapon, you can never truly turn it back. The metal remembers. The hands remember. I survived the explosion. Yes, but the man who wanted to build things died in that factory. All that came back was a man who knows how to destroy. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.